So, how do you even begin to understand the war that kicked off in 2026? Well, you can't just look at the headlines from last year. You have to dig deeper, find the signal that's been hiding in the noise for, believe it or not, about 300 years. In this explainer, we're going to trace the history, the patterns, and the strategic shifts that made this conflict not just possible, but in a way, predictable.
The first thing you have to get your head around is this. The old rules are completely gone. Those unwritten agreements that kind of governed how countries fight, the idea that there are some lines you just don't cross, yeah, those have been totally erased. And what filled that vacuum? This. A new playbook, a strategy that isn't about containing an enemy or negotiating with them. It's about total obliteration of their program and taking out their leadership, period.
And that's the day the theory became terrifyingly real. So the big question we're tackling here isn't just what happened, but how on earth did we get to this point? And the answer, well, it isn't in the events of 1 year. It's in the patterns of centuries.
Okay, so let's rewind. To really get what happened in 2026, we have to go back, way back. We have to look at the long shadow of foreign intervention in Iran, because that's what set the stage and built up the deep, deep mistrust that eventually caught fire. When you look at this timeline, what you're seeing isn't just a few random events. You're seeing a cycle. For over 2 centuries, you had stable Iranian rule. But then the 20th century hits, and it becomes a story of what Iran saw as constant foreign interruptions. First in 41, when their ruler gets kicked out. Then again in 53, when their elected prime minister is removed. So the 79 revolution, it wasn't some random thing. It was a direct and violent answer to this pattern of being controlled.
And this quote, man, it really hits the nail on the head. That 1941 intervention where they deposed the Shah and put his young son on the throne, that wasn't just about securing oil. It created this whole narrative of Iran being a puppet state. So later, when Prime Minister Mossadegh tried to nationalize their own oil industry, Operation Ajax felt like proof. For Iran's leaders, this became the blueprint for how the West operates.
But here's the paradox, right? On one hand, the Shah's era did bring some real progress. Literacy went up, healthcare got better. But all of this super fast Western-style modernization basically split the country in two. You had this huge gap between the rich and the poor, and a heavy reliance on the Savak, the secret police, to crush anyone who disagreed. It created the perfect storm for a revolution. And that deep division, well, that was the fuel for the fire that came next. The 1979 revolution wasn't just about getting rid of the Shah. It was about rejecting the West entirely. Iran's new goal was to seal itself off from the world, to become what intelligence agencies started calling a black box. A lot of people think of the 79 revolution as a purely religious movement, but that's not the whole story. Not at the start, anyway. It was actually a coalition of everyone who was fed up. You had Marxists, the Reds, you had secular nationalists, and you had the Islamist faction, the Black. In the end, it was Ayatollah Khomeini's clerical group that had the clearest, most austere vision. They consolidated power and either suppressed or kicked out everyone else. And here's where the West completely dropped the ball. For the next 40 years, they just did not understand Iran. U.S. intelligence was so fixated on the Soviet Union, on the Cold War, that they couldn't see the new game taking shape inside this black box. This massive intelligence blind spot allowed Iran's new strategy to grow and fester for decades, completely under the radar. So what was brewing inside that black box all those years? Well, this. The axis of resistance. Now, this isn't some formal NATO-style alliance. Think of it more as a network of proxies. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Palestine, the Houthis in Yemen. It became Iran's #1 tool for projecting power across the region, and most importantly, for ensuring the regime's own survival through guerrilla-style asymmetric warfare. All right, so now the stage is set. We're getting close to the flashpoint. The conflict that's been simmering for decades is about to boil over. A series of events are going to unfold so fast that the window for any kind of diplomacy just slams shut, making a fight almost inevitable. Things start to unravel, and fast, in late 2023. Attacks on U.S. bases start to ramp up. The Houthi crisis in the Red Sea starts messing with global trade. Then, a huge blow to Iran. In December 2024, the Assad regime in Syria collapses, and that severs a vital land bridge for their axis of resistance. And just a few weeks after that, the final trigger gets pulled. 60%. That's it. That's the number that changed everything. By early 2025, Iran hit 60% uranium enrichment. Now, from a technical perspective, that is just a stone's throw away from the 90% you need for a weapon. For the US and for Israel, this was it. This was the point of no return. So how did the US respond? With a brand new and frankly incredibly risky strategy they called the burden-sharing doctrine. The logic is simple, and it's pretty brutal. Step 1, the US hits Iran just hard enough to stir up the hornet's nest. Step 2, Iran gets mad and hits back, but not at the US mainland. No, they hit US partners in the region, like the UAE or Saudi Arabia. And that's step 3. Those partners are now forced to feel the shared pain, which shatters any neutrality and drags them right into the fight. And they didn't waste any time putting this plan into motion. In June of 2025, you had the so-called 12-day war with targeted strikes on nuclear sites and top commanders of the IRGC. By December, crippling sanctions make the Iranian currency, the rial, totally collapse. This sparks a massive crisis at home. The regime responds by cracking down hard in January 2026, and that brutal suppression gave the West the final moral justification it was looking for to go all in. And that brings us to the war itself. And this is where things enter a terrifying new era. This wasn't just a normal conflict. It was defined by brand new technologies and by throwing out all the old rules. On February 28, 2026, joint U.S.-Israeli strikes hit Tehran. And in those strikes, the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed. With that one single act, the centuries-old idea that heads of states are off-limits during a war was gone. A line was crossed that can never, ever be uncrossed. But what's maybe the scariest part of this whole thing is who, or maybe I should say what, was calling some of the shots. The old diplomatic guardrails, the ones based on human experience and restraint, were being replaced by AI. Pentagon War Games showed that AI models recommended nuclear escalation in a mind-blowing 64% of scenarios. They consistently chose machine bravado over human caution. There's this quote from the philosopher Eric Hoffer that just fits perfectly here. He said that mass movements start as movements, then they become businesses, and finally they turn into rackets. You could argue that by 2026, the IRGC wasn't really a revolutionary movement anymore. It was a racket focused on profit and its own survival. The decapitation strikes basically took the heads of that racket off the board. But what does that leave you with? A massive power vacuum. And that's the question we're all left with, isn't it? In shattering the old rules to get rid of a threat, did the West actually make the world any safer? Or did it just hand its adversaries a permission slip to do the exact same thing, creating a terrifying new normal where no leader anywhere is safe? That's a question we're all going to have to confront.